The return of the forgotten woman. The streets of Manhattan pulsed with life as Emily Carter stepped off the plane, the warm evening breeze sweeping her auburn curls away from her face. The city hadn't changed. It was still relentless, electric, and indifferent to the lives it swallowed and spat out. But she had changed. 7 years ago, she had left this place humiliated, abandoned, and broken by the one man she had once trusted above all others. Nathaniel Harrington, a self-made millionaire, a corporate titan, and once upon a time, her husband. Back then, she had been nothing more than an accessory to his success, the perfect wife for his perfect image. That illusion had shattered the day she discovered his betrayal. He had humiliated her, cast her aside like a useless trinket, and let the world believe she was barren, a woman incapable of giving him the hair he desired. But he had been wrong. Dead wrong. Now she was back, and she wasn't alone. Emily's hand tightened around the small fingers of her son, Ethan, as he yawned sleepily. His golden brown curls, so much like hers, bounced as he walked beside her, his tiny feet eager to keep up. On her other side, Sophia and Lucas, her twins, both sharp-eyed and observant, studied the city with curiosity. 3 children. 3 reasons why Nathaniel Harrington would regret every decision he had ever made. "Mommy, are we really staying here?" Lucas asked, his small voice filled with a mix of excitement and nervousness. Emily smiled down at him, pushing away the wave of emotions swelling in her chest. "Yes, sweetheart, this is our new home." New York was no longer just a place where she had once loved and lost. It was now the battlefield where she would reclaim her dignity and exact her revenge. She had spent the past 7 years rebuilding herself, forging a name, a career, and an empire of her own. No longer the timid, naive woman who would beg for love, she had become someone Nathaniel wouldn't recognize. And that was exactly the way she wanted it. The glass tower of betrayal. The next morning, Emily stood outside the towering headquarters of Harrington Enterprises. Nothing had changed. The sleek glass exterior, the polished steel accents, the imposing presence that screamed wealth and power, it was all the same. The only difference was that she no longer belonged to this place as a discarded wife. She was here now as a predator, and her prey was waiting inside. Taking a deep breath, she strode through the revolving doors, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Heads turned as she passed. The woman who had been publicly shamed, abandoned, and whispered about had returned. But this time, she did not shrink under their stares. She welcomed them. The receptionist, a young woman who couldn't have been here 7 years ago, glanced at her with polite curiosity. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you?" Emily smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "I have a meeting with Mr. Harrington." The receptionist hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Do you have an appointment?" "I don't need one," Emily replied smoothly. "He'll want to see me." Before the receptionist could argue, another voice cut through the tension. "Emily Victoria Carter." Emily turned slowly, her expression unreadable as she faced the woman she had once loathed beyond words. Victoria Chong, the woman Nathaniel had chosen over her. The woman who had stood in the shadows while Emily's life crumbled. The woman who had orchestrated the ultimate betrayal. Victoria stood tall, dressed in an immaculate navy blue power suit, her dark eyes sharp and calculating. If she was surprised to see Emily, she didn't show it. But Emily saw it, the slight tightening of her lips, the flicker of unease behind her eyes. "You're back," Victoria said, folding her arms. Emily smiled, tilting her head. "More than you know." Victoria studied her, eyes narrowing. "You don't belong here anymore." "On the contrary," Emily said smoothly, taking a step forward. "I think you'll find that I do." Victoria's gaze flickered toward the receptionist, then back to Emily. "If you think you can just walk in here and—" The elevator behind them dinged, the doors sliding open. And there he was, Nathaniel Harrington. Emily's heart should have clenched at the sight of him. He was just as she remembered, tall, impossibly handsome, and exuding the quiet confidence of a man who had conquered the world. But there was something different about him, too. A hardness around his eyes, a tension in his posture. For a moment, the world stood still. His sharp, stormy gray eyes locked onto her, widening slightly before narrowing into an unreadable mask. Silence stretched between them. Then, in a voice as smooth as ever, he spoke. "Emily." She tilted her head. "Hello, Nathaniel." His jaw clenched. "What are you doing here?" Emily's smile didn't waver. "Business, of course." A muscle ticked in his jaw, but he didn't take his eyes off her. The board members around him exchanged confused glances, sensing the undercurrents of tension but not understanding their depth. Victoria cleared her throat, stepping forward. "Nathaniel, I was just." "Leave," he ordered, his voice quiet but firm. Victoria stiffened but obeyed, her heels clicking against the marble as she strode away. Emily took a step closer, lowering her voice so only Nathaniel could hear. "You didn't think I'd stay gone forever, did you?" His gaze was unreadable. "I thought you had moved on." She leaned in slightly, just enough to make his pulse jump. "Oh, I have. But I also remember everything." His eyes darkened. "Emily, if this is some kind of game." She cut him off with a soft laugh. "You always did love games, didn't you?" She glanced around the room, then met his gaze again. "Well, Nathaniel, I'm back. And this time, I'm playing to win." Before he could respond, she stepped past him, leaving him standing in the middle of the lobby, silent, shaken, and, for the first time in years, unsure of what would happen next. But Emily knew. She had just placed her first move on the board. And the game had only just begun. A past that refuses to die. Nathaniel Harrington stood frozen in the grand lobby of Harrington Enterprises, watching the woman he had once discarded walk away with the same grace and confidence he had once adored. But there was something different about her now, something colder, sharper. Emily Carter was back, but she wasn't here for a reunion. She was here for war. The murmurs of passing employees barely registered in his ears as he turned toward his office. The glass walls and pristine, modern decor of the top floor suddenly felt suffocating. He entered his private office and shut the door behind him, inhaling deeply. Emily. He had spent years forcing her from his mind, convincing himself that she had been nothing more than a mistake, a chapter closed. But seeing her now, stronger, more confident than ever, rattled something deep within him. What was she doing here? Why now? His mind reeled, but he didn't have time to process. A soft knock echoed through the office. "Enter," he said gruffly. Victoria Chong stepped inside, her eyes filled with barely concealed irritation. She closed the door, her polished nails tapping against the folder she held. "We have a problem." Nathaniel exhaled sharply. "You don't say." Victoria dropped the folder onto his desk. "I did some digging the moment I saw her walk through those doors. She's been busy." He hesitated before opening the folder, his sharp gaze scanning the contents. A detailed record of Emily's career since leaving New York was neatly compiled. Emily Mitchell. The name stared back at him in bold letters. "She changed her name," he murmured, flipping through the pages. "Not legally," Victoria corrected, "but professionally, yes. She's been operating under Mitchell for the past 7 years. Nathaniel frowned. Emily Mitchell was a name he had heard before, a name that had made waves in the corporate world, a woman who had spearheaded major financial reinventions in Europe and Asia, revitalizing failing businesses and making them giants in their industries. It was her. Nathaniel clenched his jaw. "She's here for more than just business." Victoria crossed her arms. "Of course she is. And if you're not careful, she'll rip this company apart from the inside." Nathaniel shut the folder with more force than necessary. "She doesn't have that kind of power." Victoria smirked. "Not yet." Nathaniel's fingers drummed against his desk. He had been so certain that Emily had disappeared from his life for good, that she had no reason to ever come back. But now, with her standing in his building, in his world, he realized how wrong he had been. And that unsettled him. "Find out everything," he ordered. "Every detail. I want to know why she's here." Victoria nodded and turned to leave, but paused at the door. "And what if she's here to ruin you, Nathaniel?" Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his eyes darkening. "Then she'll learn that I'm not as easy to destroy as she thinks." Emily's plan begins. Emily leaned against the window of her penthouse, staring out at the city she had once fled. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the skyline. Below her, the streets of Manhattan buzzed with life. But her mind was elsewhere. She had seen the shock in Nathaniel's eyes today, the moment of hesitation, the unspoken question hanging between them. He hadn't been expecting her. Good. She wanted him unbalanced. A soft sigh pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to find Sophia, her 5-year-old daughter, standing at the doorway to the balcony, her small hands gripping the edge of the glass. "Are we going to meet him?" Sophia asked, her voice hesitant. Emily's heart clenched, but she kept her expression calm. "Not yet." Sophia frowned. "But he's our daddy." Emily kneeled, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's face. "I know, sweetheart, but we have to be careful." Lucas and Ethan appeared beside their sister, both watching Emily with wide, questioning eyes. They didn't understand. Not yet. They had been raised away from Nathaniel's shadow, away from the web of deception that had once ensnared her. She had protected them from it, and she wasn't about to throw them into it now. Ethan tilted his head. "Does he know about us?" Emily's throat tightened. No. All 3 children shared a glance, an unspoken conversation passing between them. Lucas, the most perceptive of the 3, spoke softly. "Are you afraid of him?" Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "No, baby, I'm not afraid." And that was the truth. Nathaniel had hurt her in ways no one else ever could. But fear? No, she wasn't that naive young woman anymore. She was someone new, someone stronger. She kissed each of her children's foreheads. "You don't have to worry. Mommy has everything under control." Lucas wasn't convinced, but he didn't argue. Instead, he took his sister's hand and led her back inside, Ethan following closely behind. Emily remained where she was, the weight of her past pressing heavily against her shoulders. Everything was moving into place, but she wasn't here for revenge. She was here for justice. She was here to expose the truth Nathaniel had never known. And she had 7 years of evidence to back her up. The chessboard is set. The next morning, Emily strode into Harrington Enterprises like she owned the place, because, in a way, she soon would. The conference room was filled with executives when she arrived, their eyes darting toward her as she entered. Some of them recognized her, others only knew the name Emily Mitchell. But she had their attention. That was all that mattered. Nathaniel was already seated at the head of the table, his face unreadable as she took her seat opposite him. Victoria, standing beside him, folded her arms. "Let's begin." Emily leaned back in her chair. "Let's." The meeting progressed smoothly, until Emily spoke. "As the new market strategist, I've been reviewing the company's recent financial decisions." She placed a folder on the table, her tone calm but firm. "And I've noticed some irregularities." A ripple of tension moved through the room. Nathaniel's sharp eyes locked onto her. "Irregularities." Emily nodded, opening the folder. "Massive overspending in unnecessary sectors, stalled projects, unprofitable partnerships, things that should have been caught months ago." Victoria's jaw tightened. "You're implying negligence." Emily smiled. "I'm stating facts." Silence. Nathaniel exhaled, his fingers tapping against the table. "And what exactly do you propose?" Emily met his gaze, unwavering. A complete restructuring. The room tensed. Victoria scoffed. "That would be suicide." Emily arched a brow. For who? Nathaniel studied her, his expression unreadable. But she saw it, the flicker of curiosity. The realization that she wasn't here just to shake things up. She was here to dismantle the empire he had built, brick by brick. And she wasn't going anywhere. The awakening of a sleeping giant. The tension in the boardroom was suffocating. Nathaniel Harrington sat at the head of the long, polished table, his fingers steepled as he studied Emily. Around him, the executives of Harrington Enterprises shifted uncomfortably, their unease thick in the air. Emily had just dropped a bombshell, calling for a complete restructuring of the company, a move that would unearth years of financial complacency and mismanagement. But Nathaniel wasn't an idiot. He knew this wasn't just about business. This was personal. Emily Mitchell, formerly Emily Carter, was here to challenge him, to shake the foundation of everything he had built. And worse, she was doing it with confidence, as if she had already won the battle. Nathaniel leaned forward, his sharp gray eyes never leaving hers. You do realize what you're suggesting would disrupt everything we've spent years maintaining. Emily smiled, tilting her head slightly. Maintaining isn't the same as growing, Nathaniel. But you know that, don't you? After all, you didn't build this empire by playing it safe. A murmur rippled through the board. Nathaniel's grip on his pen tightened. She was baiting him. And damn it, it was working. Victoria Chong cleared her throat, stepping into the conversation. And I suppose you have a plan, Ms. Mitchell. Emily's gaze flickered to Victoria, and for a brief moment, something cold and calculating flashed behind her eyes. Of course I do, she replied smoothly. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. She slid a thick document across the table. This contains a full analysis of the company's inefficiencies. I've mapped out a strategy that will increase profit margins by 20% within the next fiscal year. An executive, an older man with thinning gray hair, picked up the document and adjusted his glasses. This is thorough. Emily folded her hands in front of her. I don't do things halfway, Mr. Caldwell. Nathaniel watched her closely. She wasn't bluffing. She had spent time on this, carefully analyzing the company's weaknesses. But why? Why come back after all these years and target his company? Because it wasn't just about business. It was about him. He had underestimated her once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Nathaniel closed the document with a quiet thud, his jaw tightening. We'll review your proposal and discuss it further in the next meeting. Emily's lips curved into a knowing smirk. Of course. The meeting adjourned, and as the executives filed out, Nathaniel remained seated, his eyes never leaving Emily. Finally, when the room was empty except for the two of them, he spoke. What are you really after, Emily? Emily stood, straightening her blazer. Justice. Nathaniel frowned. Justice. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You never questioned anything, did you? You accepted what was handed to you and discarded me like an afterthought. You didn't even think to wonder if you had been manipulated. His expression darkened. What are you talking about? Emily exhaled, shaking her head. You'll figure it out. I'll make sure of it. And with that, she walked out of the boardroom, leaving Nathaniel staring after her, his mind racing. Something was very, very wrong. And for the first time in years, Nathaniel Harrington didn't know the rules of the game. Secrets began to unravel. Emily stepped into the elevator, her heart pounding in her chest. The confrontation had gone exactly as she had planned. Nathaniel was questioning things now. That was all she needed, for the seed of doubt to be planted. She had spent years piecing together the puzzle of her own destruction, and now she was ready to expose the truth. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. We need to talk. Tonight. Usual place. Emily's lips pressed together. James Caldwell. The COO of Harrington Enterprises. One of the few people who had seen through the lies years ago. She typed a quick response. I'll be there. As the elevator doors opened, she stepped into the bustling city street. She had built an empire of her own. one that had prepared her for this moment. And now she was ready to tear Nathaniel's world apart. Brick by brick. A meeting in the shadows. The dimly lit bar was nearly empty, the scent of aged whiskey and cigar smoke lingering in the air. Emily slid into a corner booth, her fingers wrapping around the glass of scotch the bartender had set down without her asking. James Caldwell arrived minutes later, his sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on her. He slid into the seat across from her, sighing heavily. "I knew you'd come back one day," he murmured. Emily took a sip of her drink. "I never planned to. But then I found out the truth." James nodded slowly. "Victoria." Emily's jaw clenched. "And more." James exhaled. "Nathaniel doesn't know, does he?" Emily shook her head. "He will soon." James leaned back in his seat, rubbing his temple. "You're playing a dangerous game, Emily." She smiled bitterly. "No, James, I'm ending one." James studied her for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and slid a small USB drive across the table. "I did some digging," he said. "Bank transactions, offshore accounts. Proof that Victoria wasn't acting alone." Emily's fingers tightened around the drive. "Who?" James hesitated. "Are you sure you want to know?" Emily's throat tightened. "Tell me." James exhaled heavily. Then, with a grim expression, he spoke. "Nathaniel's father." Emily's breath caught. "No," she whispered. "Yes," James said, nodding. "James Harrington orchestrated everything. He wanted you gone. He wanted Nathaniel focused on the company, not on you. So he made sure you were erased from his life." The world tilted. Emily's hands trembled as she clutched the USB drive. Nathaniel hadn't betrayed her. He had been manipulated just like she had. For 7 years, she had believed the worst of him. And now, she realized the true enemy had been lurking in the shadows all along. James' voice was quiet but firm. "What are you going to do now?" Emily's heartbeat steadied. She had come for revenge. But now she was going to burn the entire empire down. And she wasn't going to do it alone. The beginning of the end. Nathaniel sat in his office, staring at the cityscape beyond his floor-to-ceiling windows. Emily's words haunted him. "You never questioned anything, did you?" His gut told him something was wrong. Something bigger than just Emily's return. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. He opened it, and what he saw made his blood run cold. A series of documents, bank statements, transfers, all pointing to a horrifying truth. His father had set everything into motion. His father had destroyed his marriage. His father had lied to him. Nathaniel's hands trembled as he scrolled through the evidence. Then, a final message appeared on the screen. "Emily, now you know." Nathaniel's entire world tilted. For years, he had believed that Emily had betrayed him. But the truth was far, far worse. And now, there was only one question left. Would he fight with her, or against her? Because the war had begun, and Emily wasn't stopping until every last lie was exposed. Shattered illusions, rising storms. The moment Nathaniel Harrington read the last line of Emily's message, something inside him shifted. The ground beneath him no longer felt stable. His world, the one he had meticulously built over the past 7 years, was fracturing. His father, James Harrington, the ruthless man who had raised him, shaped him, and taught him that loyalty to the empire mattered above all else. The same man who had orchestrated the destruction of his marriage. Nathaniel inhaled sharply, forcing himself to read through the documents again. Offshore accounts, confidential medical records, financial transactions. Every single piece of evidence pointed to a horrifying truth. His father had paid Victoria to manipulate him, had ensured that Emily was painted as infertile, weak, and unworthy of being by his side, had fed him the lies that led to the moment he had cast her out of his life. A wave of nausea rolled over him as realization settled in. Emily had never been the villain. He had. but not by choice. A bitter taste filled his mouth. For 7 years, he had believed the worst of her, convincing himself that she had lied, that she had betrayed him. He had thought his actions, humiliating her, abandoning her, erasing her from his life, were justified. Now he knew. He had been nothing more than a pawn in a game he hadn't even known he was playing. And Emily had suffered for it. Nathaniel clenched his fists, his breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. He wasn't sure what angered him more, the betrayal of his father or the fact that he had blindly followed the script handed to him. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to him. A father's deception. The Harrington estate was as imposing as ever, a vast mansion on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by acres of meticulously kept gardens and guarded gates. It was the place where Nathaniel had been raised to believe that power was everything. Tonight, it felt like a cage. Nathaniel strode through the grand entrance, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The butler, sensing the storm in his expression, quickly stepped aside. James Harrington was waiting for him in the study. The old man sat in a leather chair by the fireplace, a glass of scotch in one hand, his silver hair neatly combed back. Even in his late 60s, he exuded authority. Nathaniel slammed the documents onto the table between them. His father didn't even flinch. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, son," James remarked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Tell me it isn't true." James sighed, taking a slow sip of his drink before setting it down. "What exactly are you referring to, Nathaniel?" Nathaniel's hand slammed against the desk. "Emily. Everything about her. You destroyed my marriage. You made me believe she betrayed me. You fed me lies. You turned me into the man who walked away from her." James exhaled, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he leaned back, his lips curling into something almost amused. "I did what was necessary." The words felt like a slap to Nathaniel's face. "Necessary," he repeated, his voice raw with disbelief. James studied him with sharp, knowing eyes. "You were young, naive, distracted. You loved her too much. She would have made you weak, Nathaniel. She would have taken your focus away from the company." Nathaniel's hands curled into fists. "That wasn't your decision to make." James smirked. "Wasn't it? Look at you now. A billionaire. The CEO of one of the most powerful corporations in the country. Tell me, would you have achieved all this if you had stayed with her?" Nathaniel's breath came in sharp bursts. "I would have had a family." James's face hardened. Family makes men soft. Nathaniel stared at him, disgust curling in his stomach. "That's what this was about. You thought Emily was a distraction, so you destroyed my life." James exhaled slowly, as if he were speaking to a child. "You were never meant to be a husband, Nathaniel. You were meant to be a leader. Emily was in the way." Nathaniel's vision blurred with rage. Emily had suffered. She had been humiliated, discarded, and forced to rebuild herself alone, all because of this man's twisted sense of control. And worst of all, Nathaniel had let it happen. For 7 years, he had lived under the illusion that he had done the right thing, that Emily had deserved what happened, that he had been justified in pushing her away. But it had all been a lie, a sickening, carefully crafted lie. Nathaniel exhaled sharply, straightening. "I was never meant to be a husband," he repeated, voice eerily calm. James nodded, satisfied that his point had been made. Nathaniel's lips curled into a dark smile. "Then I guess you won't mind when I become your worst enemy." James's smirk faltered. Nathaniel picked up the documents and turned toward the door. "You built this empire by playing God with people's lives," he said quietly. "But you forgot one thing, Father." James said nothing, his face impassive. Nathaniel's grip on the documents tightened. Kings fall. And with that he walked out. A different man. The city lights stretched before him as Nathaniel sat in his penthouse, the weight of the truth pressing against his chest. Emily had been right. She had come back to expose the lies, to show him what he had refused to see. And now that he knew, he couldn't unsee it. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He already knew who it was. Emily stood there, dressed in a sleek black blazer, her face unreadable. He stepped aside silently, allowing her in. She walked with the same unshakable confidence she had shown in the boardroom, but up close, he could see the flicker of emotion in her eyes. "Did you find out?" she asked softly. Nathaniel exhaled. "Yes." A beat of silence. Emily glanced away, nodding slightly. "Good." He studied her, taking in the way her shoulders tensed, the way she held herself as if expecting him to fight back. But he wasn't going to. Because now he knew, and he hated himself for ever believing otherwise. "I need to ask you something," he said. Emily turned back to him, arms crossed. "What?" His throat felt tight. "Did you ever try to tell me the truth? About the pregnancy? About what happened?" Emily let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "I did. Twice." Nathaniel swallowed hard. "And I didn't listen." She shook her head. "No, you didn't." Guilt settled in his chest like a stone. He hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this." Emily exhaled, something unreadable flickering behind her eyes. "I didn't come here for an apology, Nathaniel. I came here for justice." His jaw tightened. "Then let me help." Emily studied him carefully. "Why?" He met her gaze, no longer filled with arrogance or certainty. "Because I owe it to you," he said simply. "Because I need to make this right." A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Emily nodded. "Then let's bring him down." And just like that, they were no longer enemies. They were allies, and James Harrington was about to learn that he had made a fatal mistake. Because the two people he had spent years trying to destroy had just joined forces, and they were coming for him. Unmasking the Kingmaker. The city never slept. Neither did those who plotted its downfall. Emily and Nathaniel stood side by side in his penthouse, the skyline of New York stretching before them like a kingdom waiting for its next ruler. But tonight, they weren't discussing power plays or corporate empires. They were planning a war. A war against the man who had orchestrated their suffering, James Harrington. Nathaniel had spent years believing his father was an unshakable pillar, cold, calculating, but wise. He had built an empire on the foundation of control and deception, and in doing so, he had manipulated his own son into destroying the one person who had ever truly loved him. Now that empire was about to crumble. Emily crossed her arms, watching as Nathaniel sifted through the files James Caldwell had given them. "We have everything we need," she said, her voice steady. Nathaniel shook his head. "Not yet." Emily frowned. "Nathaniel, we have financial records linking your father to illegal offshore accounts. We have falsified medical reports proving he paid Victoria to lie about my fertility. We have proof that he orchestrated my exile from this company, from you. What more do you need?" Nathaniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "A confession." Emily blinked. "What?" Nathaniel turned to her, his gray eyes dark with resolve. "We don't just need to expose him. We need to ruin him. If we go to the board with only documents, he'll find a way to spin it. But if we can get him to admit to everything, to say it out loud, then there's no way out." Emily studied him, her lips pressing together. "And how exactly do you plan to get that?" Nathaniel hesitated. "He's not careful when he thinks he's won. If we push him, if we make him believe he's still untouchable, he'll slip." Emily exhaled, crossing her arms. "So we set a trap." Nathaniel nodded. She hesitated, then gave him a small, sharp smile. "I hope you're good at playing bait." Nathaniel smirked. "I was trained by the best. The art of war." The plan was simple. Make James Harrington think he still had control. Make him feel untouchable. And then, when he was at his most arrogant, Expose him. It started with the board meeting. Nathaniel entered the grand conference room of Harrington Enterprises the next morning, Emily by his side. Executives filled the long table, their eyes shifting between the two of them. They all sensed the shift in power. Something was happening. Something big. James Harrington, however, was as composed as ever. The old man sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding. "Shall we begin?" he said smoothly. Nathaniel took his seat. "Yes, let's." Emily stood, setting a thick stack of documents onto the table. Today's meeting is about the company's future, specifically the restructuring of Harrington Enterprises. Victoria Chong stiffened. "Restructuring." Emily smiled. "Yes. Effective immediately, all financial transactions from the past decade will be audited. Every partnership will be reviewed. Every offshore account will be examined." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. James Harrington remained perfectly still. "And why, exactly, would we need to do that?" Emily turned to him, her gaze sharp. "Because we have reason to believe there have been unethical financial decisions made under your leadership." James chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "That's a bold accusation." Nathaniel leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "We have proof." "Father." The room fell silent. James raised a single eyebrow. "Proof." Emily slid a folder across the table. "Offshore accounts. Millions funneled into private holdings, some linked to illegal dealings, some used to bribe key figures, and some," she let the words hang, "used to pay people like Victoria Chong to destroy my marriage." Victoria stiffened. James remained expressionless. For a long moment, the room was quiet. Then, slowly, James exhaled and shook his head. "I'm disappointed in you, son." Nathaniel clenched his jaw. "I could say the same." James looked around the room, addressing the board. "This is nonsense. An obvious attempt to undermine me." Nathaniel smirked. "Then you won't mind if we conduct a formal investigation." A flicker of something dark passed through James's eyes. But then, to everyone's surprise, he laughed. A deep, amused chuckle. "You think you can beat me, don't you?" he said, shaking his head. "You think you're smart." Nathaniel's grip on the table tightened. "I think your time is up." James leaned forward, his expression cold. "You forget one thing, Nathaniel." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "What?" James smiled. "You learned everything you know from me." Silence. Then, James turned to Emily, his eyes sharp as daggers. "And you? I should have done more to get rid of you." The words sent a chill through the room. Emily didn't flinch. "That was your first mistake, underestimating me." James sighed. "I should have destroyed you completely." And there it was. The confession. Nathaniel's hand tightened beneath the table, pressing down on the small, hidden recording device. Emily smirked. "You just did." James frowned. Nathaniel reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He tapped the screen, and suddenly, James's own words echoed through the conference room speakers. "I should have done more to get rid of you. I should have destroyed you completely." James's face drained of color. The boardroom erupted into chaos. Executives murmured in disbelief. Some recoiled in shock. Victoria Chong paled, sinking into her seat. Nathaniel stood, his voice ringing with authority. "Effective immediately, I am calling for an official vote of no confidence against James Harrington. He will be stripped of all executive powers and permanently removed from Harrington Enterprises." James bolted to his feet. "You can't do this." Emily's lips curled. "Actually, he can." James turned to the board members. "You all work for me." One of the senior executives, a man who had been with the company for over 2 decades, shook his head. "Not anymore." Nathaniel exhaled, his voice steady. "It's over, Father." James's hands trembled at his sides, his once mighty presence reduced to nothing in the span of minutes. He had spent years manipulating people, controlling their lives like a puppeteer. Now his strings had been cut, and he was powerless. Security entered the room. James turned to Nathaniel, his lips curling in disgust. "You were always weak." Nathaniel met his father's gaze, unflinching. "No, I just finally see the truth." The guards took James by the arm. And just like that, the kingmaker was dethroned. The aftermath. That night, Nathaniel and Emily stood on the rooftop of Harrington Enterprises, watching the city below. "He's finished," Nathaniel murmured. Emily exhaled. "Yes." A long silence stretched between them. Then, softly, Nathaniel spoke. "I don't deserve forgiveness." Emily turned to him, her gaze unreadable. "No, you don't." He nodded, accepting it. "But," she continued, "I'm willing to see if you can earn it." Nathaniel looked at her, a flicker of something hopeful in his eyes. "One day at a time." Emily smirked. "One day at a time." As the city lights shimmered beneath them, they both knew that while the war had ended, the journey had just begun. And this time, they would walk it together. Redemption and reckoning. The echoes of the past still clung to the air as Nathaniel stood on the rooftop of Harrington Enterprises, watching the city stretch endlessly below. For years, he had believed he was in control, the master of his fate. But in truth, he had been nothing more than a pawn, manipulated by the very man who had raised him. James Harrington was finished, stripped of power, exiled from the empire he had spent a lifetime building. But that victory came with a cost. Nathaniel turned slightly, his gaze settling on Emily, who stood beside him. The wind lifted strands of her auburn hair, her arms crossed as she stared out over the city. She wasn't celebrating. Neither was he, because while they had won the battle, the wounds it had left behind still ran deep, and Nathaniel wasn't sure if they could ever heal. The fallout. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours of the board's official vote, every major media outlet had picked up the story. James Harrington, disgraced CEO, ousted from his own empire amidst scandalous allegations of corporate fraud and manipulation. Some articles focused on the corruption, while others speculated about the personal vendetta that had fueled the coup. Journalists hounded Nathaniel for statements, but he refused to say anything beyond the official press release. This wasn't about making headlines. This was about setting things right. But just as he had feared, it wasn't over yet. James Harrington had ruled with an iron fist for decades. Even stripped of power, his influence lingered in the cracks of the company, in the old alliances and backroom deals that had kept him in control for so long. Nathaniel knew his father wouldn't go quietly. Neither did Emily. A visit from the devil himself. 2 days after the board meeting, Nathaniel found himself walking into his father's penthouse for what he knew would be their last conversation. The security guards at the entrance had been dismissed. James Harrington sat alone in his dimly lit office, a nearly empty glass of whiskey in front of him. He didn't even look up when Nathaniel walked in. "I expected you sooner," James murmured, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Nathaniel stopped a few feet away. "I came to see how it feels to fall." James chuckled, the sound dark and low. "I haven't fallen yet." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "You have nothing left." James finally lifted his eyes, and for the first time, Nathaniel saw something different in them. Not power, not confidence, but something colder, something final. "You think stripping me of my title ends me," James said softly. "You think forcing me out of the company takes away my power." Nathaniel stiffened. "That was everything to you." James exhaled slowly. "No, son. You were everything to me." Nathaniel's breath hitched slightly, but he didn't waver. "I was never more than your pawn." James nodded, as if considering it. "Perhaps, but you were my best one." Nathaniel clenched his fists. "It's over." James studied him for a long moment, then smirked. "Not quite." Nathaniel frowned. "What do you mean?" James leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Did you really think I wouldn't have a contingency plan? That I would sit back and let you take everything from me without ensuring I had my own leverage?" Nathaniel didn't move, but his body tensed. James's smirk widened. "I wonder, does Emily know the full extent of the damage you caused?" A chill ran through Nathaniel. James continued, his voice smooth and taunting. "Does she know that it wasn't just my money that forced her out? That you could have fought for her, could have looked deeper, but instead, you chose to believe the worst?" Nathaniel swallowed hard. "I won't let you manipulate me again." James chuckled. "No, of course not. But the truth doesn't need manipulation." He leaned back, eyes gleaming with amusement. "The truth always has a way of finding its own way to the surface." Nathaniel turned away, his heart hammering. "Goodbye, Father." James lifted his glass. "See you soon." Nathaniel walked out of the penthouse, but the weight of his father's words followed him. Because deep down he knew James wasn't lying. There was more to the past, and Emily deserved to know every single piece of it. A reckoning long overdue. Nathaniel found Emily at her apartment, pacing restlessly in the living room. She had been working nonstop since the vote, ensuring every corrupt remnant of James Harrington's influence was wiped clean. But when she turned to face him, he knew she could sense it. Something was wrong. Her brows furrowed. What happened? Nathaniel hesitated. He had never been the type to hesitate before. But now, everything was different. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. Emily crossed her arms. "Then tell me." Nathaniel exhaled, his hands tightening into fists. "When I kicked you out, I never questioned anything. I let my father feed me lies, and I took them as truth. But I should have fought for you. I should have trusted you. I should have." "Stop." Emily's voice was soft, but firm. Nathaniel looked up, his chest tightening. Emily's expression was unreadable. "You think I don't already know that?" she whispered. Nathaniel's breath hitched. "You knew." Emily let out a small, bitter laugh. "Of course I knew. You didn't believe me when I told you I was pregnant. You didn't fight for me when I needed you most. And for 7 years, I lived with that pain." "But, Nathaniel," she swallowed, her voice quieter now. "I didn't come back for an apology." Nathaniel's throat felt dry. "Then why did you?" Emily took a slow step forward, her gaze locked onto his. "Because I needed you to see the truth. I needed you to understand what was stolen from both of us." A long silence stretched between them. Then softly, she added, "And maybe, a part of me hoped you'd fight this time." Nathaniel's chest ached. "I will." Emily studied him carefully, then exhaled. "Good." She turned slightly, looking out at the city. "So, what now?" Nathaniel followed her gaze. "Now, we move forward." Emily tilted her head. "Together." Nathaniel hesitated, then slowly nodded. "If you'll have me." Emily smirked. "One day at a time." Nathaniel exhaled, a small smile playing at his lips. "One day at a time." A new beginning. Days passed, then weeks. James Harrington left the country in disgrace, his assets frozen, his power stripped away. Victoria Chong disappeared into obscurity, her reputation destroyed. And Harrington Enterprises, now fully under Nathaniel's leadership, began the long road of reform. But for Nathaniel and Emily, the journey was only beginning. It wouldn't be easy. The wounds of the past still lingered. But for the first time in years, there was something else in the air. Hope. Nathaniel reached for Emily's hand as they stood in the Harrington Enterprises boardroom, looking over the company they would now rebuild together. Emily squeezed his fingers lightly. "Are you ready for this?" Nathaniel exhaled. "With you? Always." She smiled, and for the first time in 7 years, it felt real. The past had nearly destroyed them. But now, they were finally free, and the future was theirs to claim.